Today, XGuard helps fleets take another leap forward to protect their investment, to make life simpler, to never yield to downtime. Introducing the next generation of front-end protection, XGuard Generation 3.
Welcome to Loaded and Rolling. I'm your host, Thomas Wasson. We're having a special edition today. This edition is where I get to share some of my experiences with you, dear listener. We typically like to have a guest on, but I will be both the host and the guest today. I'm going to be talking about the foundations of what a truckload network is. I see a lot of times, especially on media, social media, other folks will be talking about tips and tricks that you need for your business, or how to design. I don't even think they say the word design and network, where they're saying, how to pick the right customers and the right lanes. But I think it's fascinating. I'm going to go into 3 steps here. I'm going to first tell you what about a network is, and then talk about how, based on your fleet size, what does it look like? What does a truckload network look like based on a small fleet of a handful of trucks? What happens when you get to a few hundred trucks? And then how is a network on the level of like a mega carrier when we're talking about thousands of trucks on the road? And so I think it's an important topic. A lot of folks, there's a lot of information on how to get the best rate. There's a lot of information that's discussed on how to get drivers, how to maybe grow your fleet, but there's not always a good bit of information in terms of how do you make your network work? How do you make the pairs of lanes work? So let's just dive in real quick. The first thing is, if you want to think about what a network is, think about Tron or the grid. That's right. We're thinking about an interconnected points. It's kind of like a lattice or a network. And this could be like point A to point B. The most simple network is you go from one place, let's say Atlanta to Nashville. That's one leg. And then you go back from Nashville, return back to your home base in Atlanta. So that's a very simplified network. For most 95% of trucking, you're typically going to have something like that. Or you're just going to be what we call semi-random. If you stay out for a few weeks at a time, a semi-random point-to-point network means you may not be necessarily always going home. So these are the fundamentals. It all comprises of loads, and then the combinations of loads make lanes, if lanes have similar characteristics. So getting the definitions out of the way. And then you can also be a contracted, it could be a spot load, or it could be a mixture of loads. And so a network is just a combination of those items. Now, in order to have a network of loads, you need capacity, truckload capacity. That gives us another term of the density. So you could have, if you're, your density, if you're a single truck owner operator, is where you're at. That's your available capacity. Let's say you got 10 trucks. Well, maybe some of them are in Atlanta, some are in Chicago, and some are in Dallas. So that's where your capacity is available. Capacity is one of those nice sanitized words that large customers and brokerages and carriers talk about, because when you reach a certain scale, you can't just say it's Bob, Thomas, or Jim. It's a density. It's almost like quantum dynamics. Where's the likelihood of where trucks are coming in? So we're going to take that information and we're going to save that for later, because one of the big things that we're looking at is a working tractor percentage as well, the density of it, the turns per truck. There's a lot of questions you have to ask yourself. So if you have like one truck, you're going to think, how many loads can I theoretically run in a week? Now, it really does depend on things. 500 miles a day is a pretty good rule of thumb, but it also depends on your region. So you have to figure out that question first. Regardless of if you have, one truck or 10,000, the first thing to design a network is how many trucks you have and how many loads do you think they're going to turn. That's the loads per truck per week, are kind of like the turn rate. And so some carriers, it's about 3 to 4. Average length of haul between like 450, approximately 3 to 4 loads per week. That's what I saw with an OTR network, but the issue is also mileage. And so for a large carrier, it was kind of beneficial because you can make more rate per mile on your mileage bands, but also get more turns and more revenue. So, we have to think about the kind of load as well. So one of the things to think about is, do I want a 500-mile load, a 250, a 750, a 1,000-mile load, and how's it going to impact my week? So when I dispatch trucks at a small fleet, that was always the pressing, that was kind of the art behind the science. How many loads are my driver going to run? How much revenue per week? And so sometimes you have situations where you run a bunch of tiny loads, make a lot of revenue, but maybe you have low miles. Sometimes you run a whole bunch of miles, but then you also have a lower revenue because as your rate expands, your rate per mile goes down. Shorter length of haul, higher base rate. So there are a few little things to take into account for that. And so let's look at it in practice here, because the biggest thing I think about is that from my personal experiences, the old joke is when you have contracted freight, you basically get like 2 loads on one truck and you convince them they're both getting picked up at the same time. But when you have like a smaller fleet, we're focusing on the crawl phase right now. When you have a small fleet, it is literally one truck and one load. And so let's just dive into that instance. If I was building a fleet from scratch and I wanted to build my network literally just consists of the crap that I can immediately book, and I'm putting it on one truck. If I have 1 to 5, I really don't have the luxury yet of trying to figure out if I want to get a contracted customer. Now, some folks will tell you get a contracted customer. That's always the end of the day. You want to cut out a broker or a middleman. But, while you're running these random loads, you have to source and solicit and do your sales. So it's kind of like a one-man band show. And so, the very fundamentals that we'll look at later is revenue per truck per week. So how much money are you making? Loads per truck, like revenue miles, and then total miles, because we want to look at things called deadhead miles. So when we're looking at the loads and the types of loads, these are all kind of the factors that go into this amalgamation. Now, network design also goes into the type of customers you use. So a small fleet, your customers are going to be shippers, but more than likely freight brokers. And so freight brokers become your customer that you are servicing their freight. And so just like a mix, like a U.S. Express would have a mix of Fortune 500 customers, a smaller fleet of 1 to 5 trucks may have a mix of different brokerages that they work for. You treat them both the same way. Is this a good shipper? Is this a good customer? Is this a good broker? You got to ask yourself some questions. What kind of freight are you running? Are you happy with the rate that you're getting? Because this applies to anything that you're hauling for. These are kind of like the 4 fundamentals. Is it something that is the nature of the load a good load or a bad load? What does that mean? Well, are you waiting like 5 hours to get loaded on a live load at a certain facility? Or is this something where you're in and out in an hour or two? Because, it's harder for small fleets because you almost have to like try to make a mental memory of running so many loads that you remember where the good spots, the bad spots, the customers, the commodities, things like that. So you're always making these decisions. It's just the big thing is scale. And so let's step it up to another notch here. Let's say you finally, in a perfect world scenario, you had found at least one customer that you're going to run for. And you're going to use a broker to get back. That's the normal scheme. Now, you can be regional, you can be over the road, you can be running whatever the customer is telling you to run based on a spot load. But like if you're doing an RFP, what I would say is like the easiest density network would be most folks try to make a network between Atlanta, Chicago, and Dallas, the trinity of trucking, so to speak, based on length of haul and characteristics. So let's say that you do that. You want to run like one load each week. You go from Atlanta to Chicago, Chicago to Dallas, Dallas back to Atlanta, 34-hour reset. Someone can run the mileage and stuff. I'm not going to do like Bob Ross. I'm going to start pulling up a Rand McNally and like figuring out your total miles. But that's one of the big concepts. And so you can literally develop that early network. And as you're growing your fleet count, you'll get access to customers, and then customers will give you access to lanes. You do an RFP. Adam Wingfield does a great job talking about, for smaller fleets, how to navigate that challenge. He started as a driver, so there are good resources for growing the fleet. But once your fleet reaches a certain size, when I was coming from AI Fleet, that was one of the fascinating challenges. Is it's almost like growing pains. And so you could run it all spot, but now you're asking yourself, well, I've got a lot of trucks. I'm running a lot of spot freight, but I'd like to get more of that contracted freight as well. But I need to figure out like what my mix, what works. And so these are the questions you got to ask yourself as when you're finding these customers, looking through their bids. If you finally get a bid, 50, 100 trucks, you're finally kind of getting access to what larger carriers are doing. It can feel a little overwhelming. And so that's where it helps to have kind of a game plan of where you like to run to begin with, because you can't really compete against a nationwide truckload carrier. Semi-random point-to-point like a U.S. Express, Werner, Schneider, Heartland, their network is in the thousands of loads and the thousands of trucks. You're not going to be able to win that, but you can find a little honey hole of where maybe you really like Atlanta to Raleigh, or Charlotte, North Carolina. Maybe you're like in Atlanta to Jacksonville and you find some stuff coming out of Jacksonville. Maybe for you, you recognize seasonality has a trend to where you want a good rate coming out of Florida every time, but then you're going to make your money half the year when you're making the money going into Florida. There's a few little ways to play it. So that's one of the big things. I'm going to do something about like the customer mix as well, because that's another important concept to understand. Don't bet the farm on my advice right now, but customer mix becomes more important as you get larger in size. So what does that mean? Well, it's kind of like hungry hippos. The more trucks you have, the more freight you need. Remember when I talked to you earlier about maybe 3 to 4 loads per truck per week? That's kind of like the fuel for what you're your output. So you need revenue miles to generate revenue, and you need as many revenue miles via loads. So certain customers, once you get to the medium to large fleet size, you're also going to look into things like a trailer pool, and that opens up a new dimension. So small to medium fleets typically will have their own trailers. You're going to do live loads. You can't really afford extra trailers. It's expensive. You got to pay for them. But let's say that you're finally a medium fleet. You found a customer you like. You got about 50 trucks, and you're going to do a 3-to-1 ratio. So you're going to buy a bunch of trailers now. You're going to lease them. You're going to start using them. You're going to set up your first trailer pool. Congratulations. You're now beginning to enter what larger fleets get to deal with, and occasionally some brokerages and customers, which is a preload and drop and hook. But it opens up a lot of other challenges. So for smaller fleets, the biggest challenge is at first is keeping my truck moving, which is important. Now, it gets easier with the trailer pool to keep your drivers moving, 45 minutes to hook, 45 minutes to drop, or pick up. But the next challenge becomes customer characteristics. Are they unloading your trailers? Or like in Amazon, is there a universal interchange agreement? Did your trailers get moved somewhere else because you did not read the fine print, and now you don't have any trailers and you can't suddenly magically get an interchange agreement with the carrier that they loaded your freight in? So there's a lot of these other questions you want to look into. Like when I was a load planner, we had tons of issues where customers would slow down a network or a market or a zone because they would just build up trailers and they would use them as storage because their warehouse was full. It was cheaper to pay like the $15-20 a day than it was to build a bigger warehouse. So that's one of the examples of your customer mixes. For a medium to large fleet, are they using your trailers or are they abusing you for your trailers? That's one of the big things here. And that also is an impact of the freight cycle. So brokerages and stuff, when you're doing your bids, you'll have seasonal surges and stuff, but it's just something you can adjust because you're looking to pair with capacity. But if you're a carrier, your customer mix also becomes a challenge because of seasonal capacity. What does that mean? Well, let's say that we have finally 1,000 trucks. That's right. We've made it. We're in the top of 0.1%, dear listener. But the issue is out of the 10 customers that we have RFPs on, half of them may be putting their freight during different times of the year. I've seen this happen quite a bit where, you wonder why your stuff isn't getting picked up by a large carrier. Well, the large carrier would tell you, well, I don't have any capacity. And you're like, well, you're supposed to have capacity. Well, it's like fluid dynamics. The loads that were supposed to connect them into the market to pick up your stuff are actually now half of the commitment. And so when we had 50 trucks going into a market, but the customer is either not too much inventory, it's a seasonal downtime, maybe it's like it surged during the springtime like mowers at a Tractor Supply or a Home Depot, then you're going to have problems where you have to hastily backfill it and send trucks to cover the other committed freight. So there's always this delicate balancing act that is going on when we're talking about a truckload network. It explains a lot. If you're a shipper or a broker listening to this, by the way, when I was a load planner, this is the next stage here. We're going to talk about how this impacted it, because I think the cool stuff is the stories. I can get into the fundamentals of a network and bore you with the details, but the stories is what you really want. And this would happen where I would be in charge of a market. So when you get to a nationwide market, like the solo and team business unit at US Express was about 2,500 trucks. It was about a 50% OTR, 50% dedicated split at the time I was there back in like 14 to 19. So, large carriers, if you notice the thing dedicated and OTR, they reserve a portion of they even reserve a portion trying to not do OTR and just take over a facility for a customer that's dedicated. Brokers will tell you dedicated is like a lane. That's technically not a right term. If you said that in the trucking world, it's like you're dedicated on a lane. Like, am I taking over your DC? And the broker's like, no, you're just running this load dedicated for me. And you're like, no, it's not what you think it means, bub. But that's one of the big things. So we have a 2,500 truck segment. 3 to 4 loads per week. Remember what I told you earlier today? 7,500 to 10,000 loads approximately is what we need to fill this bucket. How we fill this bucket? RFPs and contracted. We need at least 75 to 90% contracted because at least that's year-round business. Spot market, it's like a sugar high. So you can take advantage, and I've seen this happen. Even when I was at US Express, we would hold back on some commitments. We would purposefully reduce lane stuff to be able to get like more freight, especially things like ad hoc, but it's a high risk, high reward strategy. It's kind of like hedging. So you could really go underwater quickly about it. So there's reasons behind it, but one of the big challenges is that you're always trying to connect the issues. Technology's getting better now, but you're always trying to fix these screw ups from the last RFP. So RFPs will go once a year. You have the cycle, you're putting in the stuff. You have, at the time you submit the RFP, you have the bids, you have the rounds, and then you have the award date, and you have the date that it starts. But for a truckload carrier, this is a never ending issue when you have thousands of trucks. So you're looking at each quarter, you have to rebid a certain portion of your network while you're also having to get feedback to find out what works. So at US Express, when I did my job at network design, the first step is we would pull up a lane density analysis. So I would look at all the large customers and I would try to map out that grid, like in Tron. We map out the network. We need to have an understanding of like a map. And it can get really complicated. I actually did some Figma and I did some Power BI overlays, and we were just trying to figure out like, from a top-down view, where the heck all of our loads were. And so then the next question is, we figured out our largest lanes. So like in the network at the time, it began in the Southeast, it would go up into the Midwest, it would go up into the Northeast, and then cycle back down through the Southwest with expedited teams crossing coast to coast. And so there's a general, like, it was almost like a circle, if it makes any sense. You would be making your money going into unfavorable regions, but you'd be balancing the network through the continuous movement. That's the holy trinity of a truckload network. It's a preload, drop, and hook, and you have a general game plan. Drivers didn't like it because they ended up having to go in the Northeast. So when you have that, you also have to balance the needs for home time. So what I used to do is driver domicile and heat density data. So what we would find out is I'd pull from our recruiting and I'd pull from our fleets. Each driver had indicated where their home terminal is, and we could find not only their home terminal, but their states and their locations. So I could find out by state. So one of the problems I saw with the network was that it was heavily balanced into the Midwest and the Northeast. But in order to get drivers home, they lived in the Southeast, Florida, Carolinas, Georgia, Texas. So you can see that's one of the challenges a carrier now faces, is because what happens if we need them to go up here, but if they go home every 2 to 3 weeks, they still have to cycle down to get home. They need return loads. You just don't move them empty. And so one of the fascinating changes that I saw, and this is an example of what not to do, is that one of the large terminals out of Georgia wanted to meet the drivers and have a meet and greet as a finishing thing. But from a network standpoint, you really can't do that, because imagine now you're routing drivers into areas that you're taking the loads that may be used for a home time or a reposition home or to a terminal or a shop, and it's now being parceled out to carriers, to the other drivers that are going to do a meet and greet. So you'll see some truckload carriers will center their fleets when you're at a large size around terminals, and sometimes the terminals will be planning their own freight. US, I think I heard back in the day it used to be that way, but large carriers will kind of parcel it out. So it really just depends. Sometimes it's a terminal based, sometimes it's an overall based network. When I was a load planner, that was one of the big fun challenges, was figuring out how to have that network work. Another thing is when pricing and sales. So when you're at a large enough size, it actually is really difficult to get everyone on the same page. A customer service manager who manages your customer mix has to deal with a load planning manager who manages the inbound, outbound flows, and then a fleet owner who manages actually the assets, in addition to an equipment manager who manages the trucks. So it's fun to see, because then you have sales and pricing in an organization. So for a small fleet of 1 to 5 or even 200 trucks, that's one person. When you get to like 5,000 trucks, when you're at the largest publicly traded companies, we were asking why Heartland's having trouble or somewhere else. It's collections of departments who focus on one very big thing. So like one of the challenges is the pricing analyst who is making the bid aware of the feedback from operations. There was an example of a stuff coming out of Dumas, Arkansas. There was a bid with a customer there, and the issue is that it bisected 2 markets. And so the Dallas market with the Dallas planner had to coordinate with a very separate person to handle that Arkansas area near like Texarkana, Little Rock market. And so the issue was that even though the lane was priced favorably to deadhead and empty move to reposition, if you have your network mixed to where the people who are planning your freight and responsible for it, there's a delineation, then it becomes another problem because you're basically moving assets away farther than what you have priced. So I've seen a few simple mistakes like that where you run into instances where you price a lane and you think it looks good, but then operationally it turns out to be really bad. So just imagine it like fluid dynamics. I'll give another example. I was the Ohio planner. We go by zip zones. Ohio 1 and 2 was like your Toledo's, your Cleveland, Ohio. Ohio 3 and 4 was your Springfield, your Cincinnati, your Columbus. So I was the southern half of Ohio. So you can imagine Ohio as a state may have 50 to 100 miles difference between where our two zip zones changed. The issue we ran into was that when Southern Ohio had too much trucks or not enough loads, you'd have to try and reposition them up into another market. So now you're having an issue where you're having to figure out your bids based on planners and zones. But in practicality and actual operations, it becomes an issue where you're giving up trucks. So I'd have days where I'd have extra trucks, but I didn't want to give them up to the Ohio 1 or 2 planner because he may have a plus 25 on his load variance, but I may be at a negative 15. I'm going to spread them out to other parts of my zone. So that's why you see a lot of folks wanting to work on automation for load planning and routing, is because the human element's still one of the biggest challenges. And right now it's still a very manual effort for fleet operations. And it's very imperfect. So you, I, 3 other people could all sit in the same room with the same amount of loads to plan. It'll be completely different. So this all just ties in. And I think that kind of coming to a close here, we got a few minutes left. One of the biggest challenges I think that people don't understand with large carriers is that they have this network. This network itself is comprised of many customers who all feel like they're the most important thing in the world. The issue is you never have enough trucks to service them all. That's why we see outbound tender rejection rates as one of our big things, because you're going to reject tenders if you have no trucks. That's why OTRI, it's all full circle. We're finally showing behind the scenes of the chaos here. At the same time, you don't want to tell the customer you have no trucks. That's why we preload it. You just simply make them preload it and pick it up a few days later. But you have to balance which ones you make angry, because like a FedEx, which you get the route, or a UPS, FedEx was really a pain in the neck because you had the actual route, millions of dollars for the single route. They would actually take precedent and priority over other customers. So it's important as well that once you find out who are your most important customers, you do have 2 options. You have 1, service the most important and screw over the other ones while trying to share the pain, or you just do it like piss them off one week and tell them you'll service their freight, and then you do, and then the next week you piss them off again and hope they forget. So there are a few strategies involved when we're talking about contracted freight. That's also why freight brokers wonder why large carriers, they're both their best friends and not. Large brokerages may have upwards of 50% of their freight going towards large carriers because the margins are really good. But what they didn't understand, and this is what I used to do as a load planner, is that their freight is the lowest priority. Like if I'm in a market and I've got a variance of 20 loads more than trucks, a plus 20, and they add in 4 more loads with the broker, it will not get picked up. And the broker will get mad. The broker will protest. But the problem is I'm going to get yelled at by like a Procter & Gamble or somebody else. And if I lose them on the contracted, then it's going to be even more problems. So, that's some of the behind the scenes stuff in terms of what does it mean within the network and confines of a large carrier, and that how carriers of all sizes have to make these decisions every single day. Now, smaller carriers make fewer of these decisions because they really don't have access to contracted freight that they are required to haul. Large carriers are the very flip side. The commitments of how many loads I'm expected to take, tender commitments, usually 95% on the volumes, is the customer committing by all the freight going into my market, because if they're not, then I'm repositioning assets like we gave 2 examples in the market, like a Dumas or another one. And then finally, working tractor percentages. Are all the fleets in a perfect world scenario, is my working tractor okay? Because 7 to 10% of your trucks may be in shop. or they may be at home. That's why you'll see a lot of times getting drivers back out on the road. It's really difficult for large fleets. So this is just kind of a primer. The fundamentals of a truckload network design encompass all of these things: the types of loads, the types of trucks, where I'm running, who I want to talk to, where does this fit in? But I think the biggest important thing for you all to take away from it is that it's extremely complicated, and I promise they're not probably trying to target you if they screw up the freight. It's just a combination of all of this hectic stuff. So been an absolute pleasure getting to share some more stories with you. We'll have some more guests coming on in the coming weeks. This is Story Time with Thomas. I didn't bring my book. I'll bring it next time. But if you're just catching us live, we will be on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you can find your podcast. Also, sign up for the Loaded and Rolling newsletter. I'll say the newspaper for a second. Freightwaves.com/loaded and rolling. That comes out Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. So you really don't want to miss any of this stuff. A lot of great content. Shout out to Adam Wingfield and a few other folks who work on helping smaller fleets. If you're looking for larger ones, it's more difficult because publicly traded companies are weird and don't like to talk to me. So I just have to tell you war stories from when I worked for them. But been an absolute pleasure. Running out of time. Join us next week. We'll do it live.